amidst COVID-19. Plethora of situations that low-skilled, low-wage migrants across different parts of the world have found themselves thrown into at the face of this pandemic are undeniable. On one hand, we have witnessed innumerable interregional blue-collar migrants in India, walking back from cities to their native villages, crossing thousands of miles barefoot, starved, with children, dehydrated, only to collapse in the middle of the highways around scorching heat. We have witnessed migrant women in India giving birth on the middle of the road during the nationwide lockdown in the country, just because they lost their jobs in the big cities and had no means and no public infrastructure to sustain themselves for just a couple of days in these cities without an employment. On the other hand, hundreds of blue-collar migrants who fled political tensions in Africa to find work in the Arab countries were forced back to their home countries right after COVID hit these host societies in Arab countries, and they lost their income. So in view of that, it is only logical and perhaps very timely that discussions on the challenges of the blue-collar migrants in cities find special and extensive mentioning with the general discussion within the context of general discussion on COVID and mobility. And to do so, well, who better than Professor Nina Glick Schiller? Professor Glick Schiller's seminal work on cities and its relations with blue-collar migrants needs no introduction, and nor does she. With phenomenal work on transnationalism, methodological nationalism, migration, cities, and urbanism, Professor Glick Schiller has deconstructed several myths around the perspectives of mobility, labor, and migration. And she has allowed the emergence of various concepts like urban sociability, cosmopolitanism, multiscalar network, disposariate that permeate the everyday lived experiences of migrants. So before wasting any more time, please allow me to welcome all of you to the second session of Corona Conversations, Mobility in a Post-COVID Future, where Professor Glick Schiller and I are going to engage in a conversation starting with the question, can blue-collar migrants survive city lives amidst COVID-19? Thank you so much, Professor Glick Schiller, for being with us today. And I'm sorry for all the technical glitches, but I hope you can hear us, and it's now going to be comfortable for us. But thank you very much for at least making this conversation happen today for all of us. We are all very grateful. So very warm welcome to you. Before we formally begin, I'll just take 1 minute to quickly say a few things about today's session. As you can understand, we will have the conversation, then we will have an open house, and the conversation will be roughly for about 30-35 minutes. The open house will be for about 20 minutes. However, we can take some time more, 5 to 10 minutes more here and there if we need to. And the conversation will be is going to be recorded, but the open house is not going to be recorded. And these recordings will be available in the GSSC website with open access. So please do not record or take pictures of any part of this conversation. Next, and lastly, regarding interacting with Professor Glick Schiller in the open house, please hold your question till the house is open, and please press the raise your hand button on Zoom. Introduce yourself briefly and ask the questions or share your comments. However, in case of a technical difficulty for which you are unable to directly ask your question, then you may please write the question in the chat box and we will take them up. So this is largely the structural specifics regarding the session, and let us now formally start with the conversation. So Professor Glick Schiller, you grew up with memories of the flu epidemic of 1917, 1918 that impacted the lives of your grandparents, your father, your aunt in a big city like New York, and also right after the First World War. So it was a post-war period, and by any standard, the lives of blue-collar migrants in big cities were tough. And on top, when this flu strain became a pandemic, it must have compounded the entire dynamic in which migrants had to negotiate with multiple challenges to survive the cities. So, from that perspective, to what extent has the ghost of a pandemic shaped and informed your understanding on migration, cityscape, and urbanity?
Okay, my turn. Thank you. First, I want to thank Amrita Adata and the University of Cologne for organizing this discussion, and I look forward to your feedback and questions. I do want to draw some lessons from the stories of my grandma and the flu epidemic of 1918. I was aware since childhood that my father's father, a young and healthy man in his early 30s, in a few days, over the course of a few days, got sick and died in that flu epidemic. And that changed the course of my family history forever. He had migrated from Belarus, which was part of Imperial Russia at the time. Around 1905, he had married my grandmother in an arranged marriage, and then she followed him to New York City. When he died, she was pregnant and she had 3 children under the age of 10, the oldest of whom was my father. She survived. She got an illegal abortion. She put her children in an orphanage and went to work in the laundry there in order to see her children and keep in touch with her children. She refused to give up one of her youngest child for adoption. And then she found work with a furrier and worked in the garment industry, and also took in boarders in her apartment. She never in her whole life slept in a bedroom. She slept in the common room so she could support boarders and feed and clean for them and get extra income. So this experience has led me to think about migration in a number of important ways. First of all, I'd like to step back and say, I've always questioned the category of refugee, economic migrant, political migrant, religious migrant, because my grandparents on both sides were all these things, and these categories just don't correspond. These legal categories don't correspond with the complexities of family stories. But basically, they fled to looking for a better life, which meant away from all kinds of religious persecution as Jews in Russia, as well as how that affected their economics and politics. But that my grandmother, Rebecca Zaretsky, despite all the conditions, difficult conditions she faced once she found herself a widow in the United States, had several things on her side, and we have to remember that. Not only didn't she get categorized as one kind of refugee or a refugee or something else, and there were no legal barriers to her entrance or to her obtaining citizenship, but also at different points in her life, the US economy expanded. Because the US economy was not just the US economy, it was a US imperial economy. And in the 1920s, and then again after World War II, the US was pulling in resources and wealth from all over the world. And that made a difference in the opportunities that my grandmother could face in her struggle to survive, in her difficult struggle to survive. It also made a difference in the fact that my father and my uncle and aunt all experienced social mobility and security. It's also important to say that it was a time of political and economic struggle around the world and in the US, and that contributed to the improving conditions. So the better working conditions in the garment industry and the better housing conditions and the better health conditions and the public education were all a result of of struggle and urban reform that was going on at the time. So we have to look not just at her life trajectory and that of her children as individual struggles in terms of her merit or the merit of a particular wave of migrants, but the struggles and the larger social and political struggles and that she faced. I also want to point out that the trauma of that epidemic scarred my my family in many ways that I'm only now becoming able to understand. I mean, there was a matter of post-traumatic stress in some ways that went through my family and exhibited itself in different ways. My grandmother never could use anything new. She stored everything new in the linen closet and used everything old, everything patched, because she was afraid she would face hard times again. And when she died, we went into the linen closet, everything was falling apart because it had sat there for decades, 50, 60 years of staving and storing for a hard time. So this affects people. But how to help people through the trauma is in part, and people are going to be traumatized all over the world from this pandemic. But how to help them depends on the struggles that are waged and an analysis of the political and economic conditions and opportunities that we face now, which are very different from the world then. So let me just say, in concluding my answer to this question, how is the world different now? Well, we're now in what I call a different historical conjuncture. That means capitalism is working differently. Capitalism, certainly people are making profits, and corporations are making profits from around the world from highly exploited labor. There's no doubt about that. They're also going back to older forms of basic theft, taking land, property, resources, public wealth under neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is called privatization, taking things, the public things, and turning them into private wealth. And this makes for a different set of conditions. So and in these different set of conditions, they're offering less to their population. So what I mentioned, that the social mobility of my aunts and uncles and aunt and uncle and father was aided by the fact that there was improving investment in education, public free university, growing social security, things like that in the United States. And certainly those kinds of investments were made in Europe from the wealth of people all around the world. Now those things, that infrastructure is being eaten away. Different rates and different times, there's more of it left in some places in Europe than the US, but it's being eaten away, and around the world, it was fragile in the first place, and now it's being eaten away. And therefore, people are being given not social supports in nation states, but only identities. So when they ask what's wrong, they're not told, oh, now we're not redistributing the wealth the way we are. It's all being stored at the highest levels. We're not building national infrastructures because we have a global economy. They're not saying that. Instead, they're saying, it's those migrants. It's those migrants. They're the people who are taking it from you. So the growth of, and what you've got to do is you're better than them because you belong, you are German, you are American, you are Indian, you are whatever. It's blaming the others. And so this becomes a time of heightened nationalism as the infrastructure is being taken away. And we have to make that analysis in order to know, as researchers and politically, how to respond.
Right. Right. I totally, I hear you. And when you say that nationalist discourses, they insist us to believe that, migration is the problem, and consequently pitting us against each other in a migrant, non-migrant binary. Now, to discuss a little bit more on this, let's just take a step back and let us think about the existential challenges of the blue collar migrants that have hit them very differently from the white collar migrants, if we can imagine, in general, all over the world, and especially as echoing neoliberal economies where, very almost no social security for gig workers or the informal sector. Now, with the pandemic that restricts mobility and in turn, the possibility of moving from, say, one job to another, and also in view of the fact that nation states are increasingly controlling their borders as their own mechanism, as they insist, to protect their own citizens from the contagion. Where do you locate all this within the structure of multi-scalar network, and how do you see it affecting or at least impacting the life of blue collar migrants? I ask this question also because you have maintained in your earlier work that migrants and non-migrants are, the differentiation between the two are blurry at best in urban spaces, and the real element to understand power relations across the multiple scale is through social cohesion. So do you still think that this approach of multi-scalar network also going to hold true during the COVID time and in the post-COVID situation?
Yes, I think that I found, and I hope it works for other people, that making a multi-scalar analysis allows us to both understand class position, different class positioning, what you're asking in terms of blue collar and white collar, but also helping us see where there are bases of unity between people who are non-migrants and migrants, people who are actually have different class positions in terms of what kind of work they do or education they've had, but are facing precarity, maybe not as much precarity, but anxiety and precarity exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, but basically because of the global restructuring of the economy and the way politics is organized. So let's step back and say, what is this multi-scalar? Do we need another term? I'm certainly not for jargon. Let me explain why I find it helpful. I think it does help us speak to the crisis and the inequalities that are intensified by urban regeneration. And as I said, help us put a framework where we can then unite people who against all forms of oppression. So multi-scalar emphasizes that we all live in networks of differential power. We're connected in multiple ways to institutions and forms of organization and corporations and families that are intertwined, networks that extend across our family, our neighborhood, our city, our region, our nation state, our larger region, supranational organizations like the EU, regions of the world, and globally. These networks cross all these and link us together. And they're not an abstract, they can actually be traced. We can do social science to actually look at the multiple connections and how the networks interconnect institutions and into our daily lives. This is a very different model than the one that is dominant in both politics and social science, that really has been called the Russian doll. The Russian dolls where there's a little tiny little doll inside a bigger one and a bigger one and a bigger one, but they're all nested. That's a nested hierarchy. And people often envision political units and territorial units that way. That is not how we actually experience the world. So we experience the world. We know we're interconnected. We know it through social media, through memes, through all these things, through videos that circulate around the world, but we know it all through that our family, our close friends or family or colleagues may be people we feel closer to and we communicate with frequently may be in some other, across an ocean, around the world, whatever, and we know them better than the person next door. So we know this, but we haven't had the language to actually cut through the standard political discourse, which which keeps directing us back to these territorial units, and particularly back to nation states, as if they were bounded. There are no national economies. There have never been national economies. That doesn't mean that states don't have power, that they can't regulate things, that they can't make life living hell for people who don't have the right documents. But that's a different thing than looking at how we're actually interconnected. So we have to be able to understand what state power is and isn't, and how we're, in fact, despite all that, interconnected. And so that's what multiscalar can do. But multiscalar doesn't take away from the fact that we have different social positionings within these networks. That we have both. We have gender, we have age, we have different personal and political and migration histories, and they give us different degrees of power, and we have different kinds of professions, blue collar and white collar. So if we have a multiscalar analysis, and we understand that these networks take place as part of the accumulation of wealth, processes of capital accumulation, then we have the tools. This looking at how capital is accumulated globally and reaches right down into our life, as it did with my phone, which when you have to not only pay for it, but then you have to pay 5 different kinds of taxes on it. And then if you don't pay the bill on time, they collect the debt, and then they collect the debt on the debt. That's all ways in which it reaches into our lives in terms of capital accumulation. So we have this interconnected, and then we have these different positionings. So blue collar workers, the ones that like the people who were thrown out of their jobs and their housing, and that's important in India, and that's why they had to go back, to try to go back to the villages, or the people in the oil states, or the people called essential workers in the United States, and blue collar workers, migrants in Europe, who have been doing the dangerous work, being exposed to COVID, while white collar workers stay home. Academics sit, or bankers sit home and get their Zoom to work and have Zoom meetings, while essential workers have had a much greater risk. We can see all that by looking at the different positions people have within these multiscalar networks. And and in addition to the category of blue collar and white collar that we've been talking about, and their differential exposure to risk and exploitation, we can also talk about temporary migrant labor and its extreme exploitation, which COVID has made clearer, because the underbelly of capital accumulation through exploitation of labor right now in Europe and in North America are temporary workers brought in, kept in camps, having no freedom to change jobs or move, being exposed to COVID in higher intensity, without access to health care, often taxed and having no access to the taxes that they pay. And then if they get sick, sent home to spread the COVID elsewhere. This is what's been happening in agricultural industries in the UK and in Europe and in North America. And this has become more visible as because of the COVID pandemic. Nonetheless, despite that different positioning, we also have to be able to say that since we're in a time where where there's more and more direct taking of resources from people, direct, as I was talking about this debt, you know, direct taking of resources from white collar as well as blue collar, from professional and non-professional, taking of resources and no guarantee for permanent jobs for anybody. So it's not just the temporary migrant workers who are facing precarity because they have no job security. It's you and me, right? It's academics, it's doctors, it's lawyers, it's bankers. They all have faced more and more short-time jobs. It's factory workers in Germany who no longer have secure jobs, more and more temporary workers. So there's a broader precarity that crosses the boundary of blue collar and white collar, migrant and non-migrant. And by seeing that broader precarity, then we also see a basis for political unity. But we have to see the problem is the way in which capital is being accumulated these days and the way labor is being therefore organized and compensated. I hope that answers your question.
Of course, I mean, from what I understand, that you're saying that, you know, multiscalar networks enables us to break free from the restricted categories of nation states. And nation states, the more, you know, they're restricting us and they're like limiting people's identity. And we can alternatively use multiscalar networks to, you know, disengage from that restriction. And of course, what I also understand that, and also in your earlier work that you have extensively talked about this, that, you know, how cities are more complicated terrain for workers of all sorts, not just blue collar and white collar, and not just migrants and non-migrants. There is a commonality of interest. There is an inherent unification, which we often tend to, you know, dismiss, or we don't really see it that way. So from just citing from your earlier work, you have maintained that cities as placemaking projects are about the ways in which residents actively construct the institutions and the political economy and the neighborhood and the city's positioning in multiscalar networks, right? So I'm just trying to imagine that in global cities, one would imagine that, you know, there's a significant population which are the residents and which are like the migrants in the informal and the formal economy both, but they contribute significantly to the regeneration of the city life. Now, so this process of regeneration invites a certain amount of trust in the lives that migrants imagine in cities, a trust in the neighborhood, a trust in the larger economic and cultural processes that encourage migration in general, and also trust in the ability of the proverbial migrant worker to make it big in big cities. Now, in the last 1 year, since COVID struck us, the plight of the low-wage migrants in cities, be it the regional migrants in India or the international migrants, the sporadic migrants of Romanian migrants in Germany, agricultural migrants, whoever that be, this entire framework has taken a massive fall, and which has come to question somewhere the indispensability of cities as quintessential locales of you know, immigration and achievements. So from that context, do you think that blue collar, low wage migrants will still trust city lives and opportunities that big cities claim to offer, or for that matter, you know, any migrant who's a gig migrant, and as you were saying, you know, the economy is really, capitalist economy is really so topsy-turvy that all of us are impacted by the precarity of the economy. So any kind of migrants, but especially blue-collar migrants, will they still have trust in the city lives or the opportunities that cities claim to offer, or back to the villages could emerge as a post-COVID pattern of return migration? Or what do you think?
Well, first of all, I'd like to point out that rather than look at global cities, Aisha Scheller and I, and a lot of our recent work, looked at disempowered cities, because there's so much work on global cities. And actually, all cities are built by migrants, I think. Even ones that have a much smaller proportion of migrants than the global cities. I mean, the German cities in the West have large proportions of migrants. But if we looked in Halat in the East, where there's a much smaller proportion of migrants, but they turned out to be significant in certain ways and really were city makers. And we started to see that when we looked at the process of urban regeneration. The urban regeneration is something that many cities decided within neoliberalism to do. Because nation states had disinvested. Part of neoliberalism is a disinvestment in redistributing resources equally across the territory of a state, and instead distributing resources only into certain key cities and regions, and others are left to molder. And that's what was, that was what was happening to the east, and that's what's been happening in Germany, and that's happened to so many regions of countries. They're seen as post-industrial, de-industrial. They're just abandoned. And the city leaders, people have to figure out what to do on this. So they say, we will rebrand our city. We will rebuild our city. We will attract capital to our city. Okay. And so they, and you see, it's almost like they're reading from the same playbook. You can go around the world. You can go to India. You can go to the global cities. You can go to some of the smaller cities, and they're rebranding and they're reinventing the city, and they're trying to attract investors. And this was all before the pandemic. The pandemic throws a wrench in all this. But even before this, what we noticed was, one, you have to, if you're going to rebrand the city, you have to make it look like it's a good place for people to come and live and invest. So you want it to be cosmopolitan or diverse. You want to make sure, you want to say that no matter what kind of capitalist you are, wherever in the world you are, you can invest your money here. Then they need migrants. They need to show that people from around the world actually live in the city, And so those migrants often become public actors in helping build the city narrative. So that in the city of Halle, which has a reputation, actually I don't think it's worse than a lot of places in the west of Germany, but has a reputation for being racist and anti-immigrant. Then mayors were saying everybody's welcome here, undocumented are welcome here, people without papers. We're all part of the city. So that makes a different environment to live in. That's one thing I want to point out when we start thinking about the relationship between blue collar workers and all migrants in cities. It made for more opportunities. But the other thing is, of course, that all people actually look for the best place to live. So global cities seem more attractive, and there are more jobs. It's a question of where the opportunities are. So this urban regeneration has created certain opportunity structures, even in these disempowered cities. On the other hand, all people, migrants and non-migrants, if there's no jobs where they're living, they go someplace else. We saw this when after the Wende, so many people in Halle left and went to Western Germany. They love their city. It's actually a very nice place. But there were no jobs, so they left. And now some of them are coming back because the urban regeneration actually has created more middle class jobs there. So, we have to stop thinking that migrants are a special category that act in some different way, that they need to build trust, or they need to be integrated. People, if there's no jobs and possibilities, they leave, or they get angry if they can't leave. And people, whether they're migrants or non-migrants, look for possibility structures. Okay. Urban regeneration creates some of those possibilities, but But in many of those places, these possibilities are created through public debt. And then it comes time to pay the piper, right? And then it comes time to pay this debt. And now in the middle of COVID, these cities are going to be in even worse shape generally, unless other aspects of government bail them out, because there'll be fewer and fewer resources for local programs, for local education, and neoliberalism has dumped more and more responsibility on local governing units. So they don't have the money and they have responsibility. And that leads, again, to then the temptation for people to point to migrants as the source of the problem. Does that speak to your?
Yes. It does, because if I understand you correctly, I think what you're trying to talk about is that, opportunity and economic and social positioning is what that's going to determine, and not the trust, as a sentimental connotation to determine whether migrants settle in a city or move from a global city to an disempowered city, or vice versa. So you're talking about cosmopolitanism, you're talking about opportunity and economic and social positioning, and like social structures that those cities offer. So yeah, so I mean, I get that, but I'm just wondering, within the structure of this pandemic right now, and you also talk about cosmopolitanism. Therefore, I would like to ask that, do you think that, is there a possibility that COVID-19 will bring the ethnic lens back in the discourse of city making and urbanism, rather replacing urban sociability and cosmopolitanism? Do you think that could happen?
Yeah. Yes, I think it's totally possible because of this logic of blame. First of all, the urban regeneration projects, as I said, they're going to and have run into more and more trouble because there's this lack of resources. So we saw that in our research. So they're very welcoming, but then. And what happened actually in Halle and in Manchester, New Hampshire, instead of getting this huge influx of capital that created good jobs for everybody, they ended up with service industries and low-wage work. First they had telephone, they had answering services, and now they've got what's the word? Storage depots and transfer depots, and very unskilled labor, hard labor, warehouses to fill orders. Now migrants provide some of the labor for that. So in that way, blue collar workers find jobs in these low wage industries, at home health care, and healthcare workers and hospital workers. But on the other hand, as there's no public services, as education gets cut, which is about to happen big time here and in the UK and probably across Europe, as education gets cut, and as taxes go up to pay for the increased expenses, then the logic of blame becomes greater. And if people are and what we know about ethnic identities is that if people are being pointed to as the source of the problem, then there's regrouping. I mean, it's then people feel they can only trust their own. Their own becomes a category when it wasn't before. So people reinvent their ancestral identities that actually maybe it's several generations old, maybe it's all fictive, but they reinvent because they need to belong somewhere in this precarious world, and they're being attacked. And racism increases. As racism increases, that makes people more aware. People felt perfectly home. There's a lot of data that say second generation migrants really identify with the city they live in more than the nation state. But suddenly you don't even feel at home in your city if people are looking at you suspiciously, thinking you might be undocumented or taking their job. So yes, I think the ethnic lens and narrow kinds of nationalism and racialized kinds of nationalism, racialized identities can definitely increase. But I also think that the opposite is going on. Both is going on. We're at a very polarized time. You can see it. Anyone who's been watching U.S. politics, we're in a very polarized time. But we're also at a time when people are looking to unite against all forms of oppression. The Black Lives Matter movement was very interesting in the United States, and it spread around the world, and it is very interesting, and it makes one very hopeful because it wasn't looking, it really got people from all backgrounds together to look at the sources of racialized oppression and how that was linked to their own problems, whether it was gay, lesbian, and transgender, or immigrants became part of this movement, or indigenous people in the United States. These are populations that have been separated into their own, searching for their own culture and their own identity. And then they started to look around and saw where the structural racism was coming. Aha, it's the structure. If it's the structure, then it's not just, I need more than thinking about my own identity. I have to look at what the structure does to people. And that's what's been happening. And that's where the hope lies, because in the other path lies fascism. I mean, that's what it is. That's what we've seen in the Trumpism. It's straight out anti-democratic, rely on a leader, a strong leader, and unite people around a core nation and a sense of racialized belonging. And to oppose that, we need to have a broad sense of unity. So.
Right. So, yeah. So the point that we're trying to understand here is that how we can set aside, the imposed categories of nation states and explore opportunities to address exploitation, which goes beyond the stereotype of who is a migrant and who isn't. Just taking ahead from what you are saying, I think there are several things that could emerge from our conversation today. And let me quickly share, and like in terms of our conversation today, what I understand from what you were saying. Firstly, migrants and non-migrants are always in interaction with each other, and through participation, through social exclusion, or through even social cohesion, as you keep talking about, right? And therefore, what you call as urban sociability is what maybe we increasingly need to engage with to understand the entire process of city making, where all sorts of people inhabiting the city are trying to contribute to what the space is all about, like especially the blue collar migrants through their everyday invisibility and apparent silences. They do bring in certain very interesting characters to city lives, which surface only when there is a social movement against the exploitation that they're facing. Otherwise they're all very silent, all very invisible to us. But it is undeniable that the character that they bring into the city life, and that is where I think the idea of urban regeneration process becomes so significant. And in fact, time and again, in terms of placemaking projects, I mean, even through the works of Arjuna Padurai, Martin Albro, we have brought the discussion on on the universalization of global financial flows, global cultural flows into the context, and which only tells us more about how we need to look beyond the existing models of categorization, because global flows of events, institutions, and structures have made migration experiences over the years already identifiable across the world. Like neoliberal capitalist expansion has made exploitation standardized to the extent that global and local are intrinsically tied together. So in that light, social cohesion maybe defines the pulse of the migrant lives much more than the general framework of transnationalism today. So another point that I wanted to reflect on is like, that comes out of our conversation, as we see, as I see it, is we do need to think about new languages to understand migration, the migrants' relation with cities and their role in city making even more now, because while, as you're saying, time and again, that while neoliberal capitalism compels migration, it also invokes sentiments of racism and hypernationalism. So therefore, it is no surprise that dispossession and what you call disposariate, it is an existential crisis, not just restricted to blue collar migrants, but it spreads across different types of migrants, and the high skilled white collar migrants also feel the pinch. So, but it is, while I'm not trying to dismiss the fact that labor exploitation of blue collar migrants is much more than any other category of migrants, but it is also equally true that massive corporatization has expanded the gig economy to the level that both blue collar and white collar migrants are reduced to temporary workers. So coming to think of it, soon enough we may not even need these restricted categories of blue collar, white collar, etc., to understand the lived experiences and everyday insecurities of migrants. And we may like to engage more and more with multi-scalar networks and take a, just echoing you, a global perspective, as you call it, to explain the entire migration situation. Now, to think about a global perspective, what could be, in my understanding, a better reference point to engage with this global perspective than the coronavirus pandemic that has really impacted both everyday lives and grand structures and institutions all across the world? So from what I understand from our conversation today, an entirely new discourse could emerge from this pandemic as an epoch in history, to put in a Marxian fashion, that is, affecting migrants of all sorts, across ethnicity, across class differences, across gender. But it is not to say that migration will decrease or will become more challenging. In fact, in some cases, migration might even be facilitated due to COVID. But notwithstanding the trajectory of migration, what I understand, what I think is COVID and post-COVID future would offer us a very important starting point to talk about migration experiences in city lives from a global multi-scalar perspective. And from that light, I think today's conversation has been really, really meaningful. And as I said in the beginning, very timely. And we can definitely take this forward to construct newer frameworks to understand migration better in the coming days, I hope. So with that note of hope, let us now conclude this formal conversation as of now, and we can, just start with the open house for further discussion and further deliberation.